We are here with Alon Pinkas, who is former Consul General in New York, former ambassador for Israel, advisor to four different foreign ministers, and Ehud Barak when he was Prime Minister of Israel. Thanks for sitting down with me.
Pleasure.
Uh, this is, a conference, the Israeli Presidential Conference, third year that this is running. Obviously, the big issue here, one of the big issues that's being discussed in great detail, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last year, you wrote a piece for Politico, a very interesting piece, by the way, about the criticality of having the United States involved in that process. Tell us a little bit about why you see America as a critical partner in that peace process.
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. Some of which, part of it is a sequential issue of how the U.S. perceived the region 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, and now how it defined its national interest. And another has to do with the U.S.'s relations with Israel. For a long time, the U.S. saw itself, defined itself, perceived itself as being an honest broker, an intermediary, a go-between, a superpower that can provide both sides with a strategic, political, and diplomatic umbrella. The only country that can bring them together because of its interests in the region. That didn't work. There was no shortage of goodwill. There was no shortage of knowledge, a wealth of knowledge in the American and successive American administrations. Let's go back to the George H.W. Bush administration, the Madrid conference, and then Bill Clinton, two successive Clinton administrations, George W. Bush, and now Barack Obama. The other angle is to look at how this administration, and to a lesser extent even Bush, in his late months, in say the last year of his 8-year tenure in the White House, but particularly this administration, it sees its role not as a problem solver, as Jimmy Carter did, for example, as Bill Clinton did, for example, but it defines its role in the region as advancing American interests. And American interests demand, or it is imperative or conducive to the advancement of American interests, that the U.S. be involved in bringing together an Israeli-Palestinian process, or if it ever comes to fruition, a solution. I also subscribe to something that American diplomats have said for a long time, repeatedly in different administrations, that the U.S. cannot want this more than the sides. And if both sides demonstrate, I'm not going into the who's right, who's wrong issue, sure, but if both sides demonstrate a degree of intransigence, reluctance, standoffish, aloofness attitudes, there's so much the U.S. can do. I think there was a window of opportunity that corresponded to the Clinton years in the White House, in which the U.S. could have done this successfully. It tried. There's no question about that. It tried. It did not work. And I call this a window of opportunity because it corresponded to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the not yet ascent of China, India, Brazil, and the resurrection, the diplomatic resurrection of Russia. The European Union was still searching for some kind of common foreign policy, which I don't think they have found yet, but nonetheless, it is better. It looks as if it is more composed now than it was, say, in the mid-90s. It was post-Cold War, post-Soviet Union. The Oslo process opened an era in which everything and possibly anything could have been achieved. It didn't work. It didn't work not because of the U.S., but the decade ended almost. I'm not being exact in terms of the dates. The decade ended with 9/11. 2001 is not exactly the decade, but
No, but I mean that makes sense. So, I mean, because it was about 90, it was late 1990, I think, when with Oslo, if I remember correctly. So yeah.
Well, Oslo was 93.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right, 93.
No, but 90 was the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. 91 was the first Gulf War. August of 90 was the Iraqi invasion into Kuwait. Right. The entire region changed. The U.S. attacked Iraq. throughout the 90s, the Soviet Union no longer existed, which means the Arabs were deprived of a superpower umbrella or superpower endorsement. The patron-client relations that existed throughout the Cold War between the USSR and Syria, Egypt, and some other countries, and the US and Israel no longer existed. It didn't work. What you could see now is a US that is deeply involved in the region, physically, in Iraq and Afghanistan, is engaged militarily in Libya and to a lesser extent in Yemen, is leading the world's effort to prevent Iran from going nuclear. Who knows what may hold, what may transpire in terms of US involvement in Syria. Egypt is no longer the regional power, the dominant regional power that it was throughout the 80s and the 90s. There is the ascent of Turkey, and focal points of power are shifting. Yet some U.S. interests remain permanent. The flow of oil through the Gulf of or the Straits of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia, and so while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not top the list of what has to be done in the Middle East, it's certainly right up there amongst the 3-4 major issues. So I don't think there is any even remote possibility of an agreement without U.S. involvement. And I don't see any substitute for the U.S. Yeah, the U.S. power is waning, and the superpower is diminishing, and it's imperial overstretch. We're familiar with these cliches. Some of them happen to be true, some not so much. Nonetheless, I don't see any power that could fill the role that the U.S. did, perhaps unsuccessfully, did provide and should continue on providing.
Then let me ask you about your partner in these negotiations, the Palestinians. A lot of people in the United States are not seeing any viable partner for peace in these negotiations, and are sort of throwing up their hands and saying, there's not much reason for the United States to even bother to be involved at this point. The Palestinians aren't serious about recognizing Israel's right to exist. They're not serious about negotiations. Now, here at the conference, I heard various voices saying, you can't just throw your hands up in the air. We have to continue to press for direct negotiations. Shimon Peres said that last night. Zivi Livni said it in the plenary session this morning. Yeah. So, who's right, and what's the proper attitude, I guess, for Americans to approach this with?
Okay, it's a complex question. Here's the thing. Partitioning the land is not something I've been dreaming about. It is not one of the basic tenets of Zionism, and the Palestinian state is not something I look forward to. That said, a disassociation, a segregation, some kind of partitioning of the two ethno-religious national groups, Israelis and Palestinians, is imperative. And I'm not doing this for the Palestinians' sake. I'm doing this for Israel's sake.
Libni said the same thing. I mean, in order to keep the integrity of a Jewish state, you really have to do that.
Now, that doesn't mean it's doable, attainable, or viable just because I want it to be, and just because it's imperative that I actually do it. But here's where it gets complex. If we revert constantly to the who's right and who's wrong and who's serious and who's not and who's risking and who's not, and who said yes to the UN General Assembly partition plan in November of 1947, and who said no, and who said no recognition of Israel as early as 1967, well, before that, but in recent, post the Six-Day War, we'll get nowhere. Because I could draw a list of how right we are, and I could draw a even longer list of how many opportunities the Palestinians have squandered, In fact, if you look at their history, it is a case study, a textbook case study of poor statesmanship. A lot of salesmanship, much less statesmanship. They could have had a state in 47 and in 67, and again in the 70s, and again in the 80s, and again after Oslo. In fact, had they lived up to Oslo, they would have probably been celebrating their 10th anniversary. Had they said yes to the Clinton parameters presented in July of 2000 at Camp David in Maryland, they would have now more or less celebrated their 4th anniversary. It would have taken some time for a Palestinian state to be established. All that said, it's not the Palestinians' right of self-determination or their plight or their historical mistakes that I'm concerned about. It's the future of Israel. It's very simple. The truth is not about history, it's about demography. It's about demography stupid, if you want to paraphrase that. The Jordan, between the Jordan River on the east and the Mediterranean on the west, there are roughly 10 million people. 52% Jews, 48% Arabs. And that includes the 1.2 million Palestinians living within pre-1967 Israel. But if I look at the demographic package, it's 52 to 48. Any demographic projection, and the beauty and the tragic simplicity of demographics is you cannot manipulate. You can delay it by virtue of, say, 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union who come to Israel in the early 90s, so you win a decade demographically. But what do? You waste that decade by building settlements, not because we don't have a right to, but because it's the unwise, imprudent, and myopic thing to do, because who's going to take them out now? The point is that unless we somehow separate these two communities, there will come a point where Palestinians will outnumber Israelis. That point is not some distant point in 2537. That is likely to happen by or around 2020. 2020, some demographers think this could happen by 2016, some think it's 2022. Either way, we're looking at something which is concrete, tangible, and ominous. Unless we find a way to do this, we will have to bear the consequences. And for the last 2,000 years, we've been whining about how right we were in the year 70 AD. Well, you know, history and politics are not about who's right, but about who's smart. Not about who has a better story to tell and whose narrative is closer to the truth, but about who's a statesman and who makes decisions. And basically, it's about choices. And choices need to be made. It's not easy. I, too, fear that a Palestinian state has all the attributes and warning signs of a failed state in the making. And I know that the price to pay for finding out that indeed it evolved into a failed state will be an exorbitantly high price to pay for Israel. There are ways around that. Are the Palestinians the ideal partners to, or ideal interlocutors? No, the Swedes are better, the Canadians are probably better. Guess what? We don't live in Scandinavia, nor do we inhabit parts of North America. This is a lousy neighborhood, always has been. Right now it is, and despite what Shimon Peres, my mentor, would tell you, I think it's a lousy, the lousiness of this neighborhood is not going to go away anytime soon. So you got to do what you got to do, and you have to do what's right to ensure the future of Israel as a Jewish democracy. By Jewish, I don't mean theologically. By Jewish, I mean in terms of the ethnic and value makeup.
Cultural, ethnicity.
Civilizational, and this is not any, I'm not saying this in any way, which or form, to patronize or to be condescending toward the Palestinians. That just look at the economics. $27,000 GDP per capita in Israel cannot cohabit with a $900, perhaps less if you factor Gaza into this. No, the Palestinians are not ideal, but you just have to do what you have to do. And by saying they are not partners, you're saying something which may be true to a degree. However, you're not solving any problem. You're just delaying the inevitable, and the inevitable is a binational state, which is something I dread.